Yeah.
Leon Panetta joins me now. Thanks so much, Peter, as we are joined by a former chief of staff, former defense secretary, former CIA director, OMB chief. You've had all the jobs practically in Washington. Have you ever seen a public display of that kind of fight between congressional leaders of one party and the president of another?
Andrea, I think we have just seen a perfect example of how not to govern the country. To have that kind of dispute and do it openly before the press at a time when they really do need to sit down and see if there's a way to work out a deal here. But to confront each other that way and to have everybody yelling at one another, I think has just sent a terrible message to the American people about how our democracy functions in Washington.
Well, the president was interrupting Nancy Pelosi from the get-go. Should they have not, should they have not pushed back? Should Chuck Schumer have not jumped in? And of course, it's awkward to put her in the position of saying, let's not do this in front of the press, because then she'll be criticized roundly for lack of transparency. So were they in a no-win position on his turf?
I think when you're in the Oval Office, the best position to take is to say, we're here to discuss these issues, and we're not going to do it openly in front of the press, period. I think that's the better approach. Once you engage with this president, he's going to keep coming back at you, and this thing could go on for another 3 hours just to have them yelling at each other. I just think it's much better to just say, we're here to discuss this. We're not going to do it before the press, period.
You know, there's a lot of fact-checking that we have to do. One of the things that he threw out there is that they have stopped 10 terrorists at the southern border. That's news to a lot of us. Obviously, they have the intelligence. We don't. But I would be very surprised if they had stopped 10 terrorists in recent weeks at the southern border without announcing that to the public.
I would be too, but this is a president who talks about invasions, who talks about this country being under siege by immigrants coming into this country, and facts don't matter a great deal to this president. He's basically trying to create fear in the American people with regards to our border situation, and I think we all understand that this is a challenging issue. That border security does need to be increased. Rational minds ought to be able to find a way to increase security at the border without this argument over whether or not we build a wall or not. The issue is that we can develop border security, effective border security, and that ought to be what, frankly, both the president, the Democrats, and the Republicans focus on.
If you were defense secretary in recent weeks, would you have agreed with the deployment to the border of U.S. troops, given the situation down there?
I think it's a dangerous precedent because of the posse comitatus law that says that the military cannot engage in law enforcement. To have the military go down there and play that role. Now, they obviously have to be careful. They've been stretching concertina wire along the border. They've been doing some other tasks there. But I think this is a responsibility of the Border Patrol and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They're the ones that have the responsibility to protect our border, and that's where the responsibility ought to lie. The military, their principal responsibility, frankly, is to be used in order to protect our national security. And that's the role they ought to be protected for.
How jaw-dropping is it for a 36-year-old Republican operative working for Mike Pence to turn down the offer to be chief of staff of the White House? The president now says he's in no hurry to replace John Kelly, but Kelly is now going to be leaving by the end of the year.
Well, as I understand it, he had some personal reasons. He's got triplets, he's got a family, a young family, and that he wants to return back to Georgia. I understand those reasons. And I think his offer was to try to serve as chief of staff on an interim basis, but that was obviously not acceptable to the president. So I understand the reasons involved here. Look, it's not going to be easy for this president to be able to establish a good relationship with the chief of staff. There are two primary ingredients. Number one, you have to have a relationship of trust. You got to be able to trust the president, and the president has to be able to trust you. And secondly, the president has to accept a certain amount of discipline in order for the White House to work effectively. This president has been very difficult to establish those kinds of principles in the relationship with the chief of staff. So it's not going to be easy for him to have a very strong and effective chief of staff, because that's not in his nature.
Leon Panetta, thank you so much. Thanks for standing by with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.